A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, here we are under a cost of living pressure climate in what's called a per capita recession here in Australia, federal elections looming. New developments are happening daily around the world, and you've been hearing about the major financial reforms in the US, where Donald Trump is implementing dramatic change and, stock markets are soaring, our dollar has been falling, new global trade wars are fueling all sorts of uncertainty. So we're back talking money today with finance expert Alex Cook. Our focus today is on the Trump era and how a Trump government will impact your finances. Alex Cook is a former stockbroker. He's been a successful financial planner, and he's the founder of Wealth with Purpose. His ministry is to help equip Christians to honour God with their finances by teaching sound financial skills. Alex Cook, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Happy New Year. I'm not sure if you're still allowed to say that on the 6th of February. Can you still say that?
No, it is February, but I'm happy if you say that, and I'll say Happy New Year to you because this is our first opportunity to really unpack some things. And you know what? Since last time we spoke, lots of things have changed, haven't they? So let's start
they certainly have.
Let's start with, there's been the inauguration of Donald Trump, and in 2 weeks, it looks like he's changing the world. That includes us here in Australia. What's your initial assessment of Donald Trump and his plans?
Well, look, I think you could best describe it as a whirlwind. I mean, it's incredible what he's done in just 2 weeks. Whether you like the guy or not, you have to give him credit. I mean, if you want someone to get something done, Donald Trump's your man. I mean, it's just incredible what's happened in just such a short space of time. And I think there's some really good things. I know Western media particularly paints him as a pretty nasty kind of guy, but he's already done some great things let's take free speech, for example, and the removal of censorship. That's one of the big things he was strong on. I don't know if it's been finalised yet, but he's trying to appoint Robert Kennedy to make America healthy again. So I don't know if that's been approved in the last day or so. That's been in front of one of the committees, and he's secured the border. So illegal immigration into America has plummeted 94% in 2 weeks. So that's incredible. And then you've got tariffs coming on Canada and Mexico, and then to be put on hold the next day, courtesy of Mexico agreeing to send 10,000 troops to the border. China, I think, has had 10% tariffs put on them. He's mentioned that Europe are on the list. Hopefully Australia's not on the list, but certainly Europe is. He announced that he's going to ban central bank digital currencies. He's very pro-crypto, but he's going to ban central bank digital currencies, which we'll be interested to see how that plays out after he's gone. But certainly that's a good thing. He announced an energy emergency on day one because he wants to basically make America energy self-sufficient again, which is great. He announced $500 billion to go into artificial intelligence, and one that people have probably seen, especially if they're on Twitter, they've probably seen the formation of the Department of Government Efficiency. An oxymoron if there's ever one. But Elon Musk is taking that on. And what's interesting, the last few days, they've announced they're going to do a major investigation into the Treasury Department to see where the money's all going. And that's met with a howl of resistance. And funnily enough, the head of Treasury, that was announced.
So we're talking major financial reform in the United States. Some might be thinking,
Absolutely.
Well, what's happening in the United States? That's good for them. Not sure we'll be as affected. Of course, we'll often talk about America sneezing, us catching a cold, the effects that have ripple effects around the globe. You mentioned the tariffs, Canada and Mexico, and plans for Europe and tariffs for China. But I wonder what might happen in Australia. And I guess we've been thinking that we're a little immune from those sorts of tariffs. And how does Australia stand, do you think, so far as what Donald Trump might have planned?
Oh, well, look, we'll be affected no matter what, because the world is so globalized now, it's inevitable. And if you look at the Aussie dollar in the past couple of weeks, it plummeted as soon as the tariffs were announced because the problem with tariffs is it's going to lead to global trade slowing down, and therefore obviously the Aussie dollar plummeted, the US dollar rallied because tariffs are inflationary, and especially inflationary to Americans. So that means that interest rates are likely to go up in the US if he continues this path. And hence our dollar's weaker, as are all the other currencies around it, like the Mexican peso, the Canadian dollar. All those things have all weakened. So the short answer is it's already affecting us. I think the good news for Australia, though, is our impact on us is going to be far more indirect. Where I think we'll be affected is more via China. So obviously, if America's putting tariffs on China, that will flow through to a weaker China, and therefore China's our number one export partner. That's likely to affect us. If he put tariffs on Australian goods into the US, I don't think it would have a huge effect because only 4% of our exports actually go to the United States. So it wouldn't be too dramatic. Where I think what concerns me more is either the global economy slows a lot because of all these tariffs, if they go through. I mean, this is the $1 million question. Are they there for economic reasons? Are they there to bully people into do other things? I mean, as I say, it's literally day by day. But I think the inevitable reality is everyone is going to be affected. And it's too early because, as I say, the policies change daily. I mean, the tariffs went on one day, postponed the next. So it's...
And as you say, Donald Trump going in hard, and that creates an opportunity to do a deal, like a bargaining chip. He's able to then have influence because he recognises that the US economy is so strong and people are reliant on US trade for their own economies to remain buoyant. But the issue here, I guess, where do we see inflation in all of that? Because if prices go up because tariffs go up at different nations around the world, how will that affect the inflation issue, do you think?
Well, and that to me is the big concern. Once again, the uncertainty is what is actually going to be the end result. What tariffs are we going to actually end up with, and that's the unknown. But if I was to give people an example, because this that way they'll see how it would affect them. Let's say Australia exported a $100 product to the US, and then the importer in the US then sells it on for $200. If Trump puts on a tariff onto the imported good, suddenly the price goes from 100 to 125. Now that importer has a choice. Either they can go back to the Australian company and say, hey, we don't want to pay as much anymore, or they can absorb it in their own profit margin, which they're not going to be too keen on doing, or they just bump up the price. The reality is it's probably going to be a mix of all those things. But let's say they pass it on in full, then that $125 good that they were on selling at 200 is now going to sell for 225, which means the US consumers all of a sudden paying 11% more. So what you've got to remember is one of the promises Donald Trump made was, I want to make things much better for the middle class. I want to bring the cost of living down, etc. But tariffs do the opposite, and there's plenty of economic history to show that. So of all the things he's doing, I think a lot of what he's doing is great, but it's the one policy area that I have most reservation about. But as I say, you wonder if he's doing it for economic reasons. Is he doing it to bring manufacturing back to the US? Is he doing it to stop illegal immigration and fentanyl being imported into the US? So it's what's an economic policy is also being used as a blunt tool for other things. So it's to answer the question, it's all inflationary, but what will be the end result and how bad will it be is anybody's guess.
So inflationary in the US, and that may force the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates there. What does that mean for our interest rates here and for inflationary pressures in Australia?
It's a great question. It's going to be interesting because there's a few factors at play. So because it's inflationary in the US and rates in the US will probably rise, in Australia will likely fall. Okay, so that'll give us a bit of an economic cushion. One of the beautiful things about what we have in Australia, we have a floating rate exchange system. So what it means is our currency is likely to devalue, which makes our exports cheaper. So that's going to be potentially a good thing for Australia in that regard. But will that be offset by a weaker global trade? So there's been a lot of study in the last few weeks. There's a lot of analysis coming out. And one was a study that said if global trade was to fall by 10% as a result of all these things going on, then Australia's GDP would probably fall by 1%. Now, that would put us pretty much in recession because Australia's been borderline recession now for the last year. So, and the challenge Australia has at the moment is you have a strong public sector because of all the government spending, and you have a very weak private sector. But the Reserve Bank, I would imagine, if they're more worried about growth, then they'll be lowering rates. And of course, the expectation over this so far, if you listen to most of the commentary, they're expecting rates to come off this year, only a little bit. But, and I think this is the big unknown, is if these policies of Trump turn out to be far more inflationary than expected, then obviously the Reserve Bank will hold fire and be much more cautious. And, the worst case scenario down the track would be higher rates. I don't see that happening in the short term because I think the economy is just getting weaker. But that would be obviously a big concern for Aussies because Aussies are, as you and I have spoken about many times, loaded to the eyeballs with household debt.
Helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
And you're welcome to join us in this conversation. Our talkback line is open on 1-800 316 316. We're talking about Donald Trump and the effect of his policies, the Trump era, and how that's going to impact your finances. So 1-800 316 316 to join in our conversation. Our special guest is Alex Cook, former stockbroker. He's the founder of Wealth with Purpose, and he's happy to take questions and comments from you. 1-800 316 316. Let's talk investments here for a few minutes. Alex, what sort of impact do you think these new policies that are now affecting a ripple effect around the world, what are they likely to have on investments in all the different categories we might be looking to invest?
Yeah, look, great question. I think the key word for the year is uncertainty. Although I think, interestingly, the future is always uncertain. We just think it's more certain. When things are cruising along normally, we think future certain, and then all of a sudden something comes and it changes our opinion very quickly. So in one sense, as I say, it's always uncertain. But with all the policies that are coming out at such rapid pace, markets, I don't think, know what to do or how to react. So when he first announced the tariffs, the stock market quickly plunged a couple of percent because markets realised that that's negative economically. But then the following day, when he said, "Oh no, they're postponed now because Mexico have agreed to my demands and sending 10,000 troops," all of a sudden markets rocketed back up. So when you're going to get this sort of flip-flop policy response or demands being met, I mean, the question is someone going to eventually push back? Now, China has pushed back. China has started putting tariffs on American goods, but it's going to be a real question of what's this going to look like in 6 months is the big question. So I think between now and then, you're going to have a lot of uncertainty. Generally, this sort of uncertainty is negative for shares. And as something, I've probably said to listeners in the past year, shares look very expensive already anyway. So if you're going into a weaker economy, and certainly Europe is very weak, and Europe is very vulnerable to tariffs, then I think you are going to see the stock market slump. I think the $1 million question is always just a question of when, because no one knows when. Trying to time things is impossible. But I think shares is going to be a problem. The bond market's a bit more interesting. The bond market, if economic growth is weak, then bonds typically do well, as in yield, interest rates fall and bond prices go up. So that's typically what would happen. However, what's interesting in the last few months, the Federal Reserve in America has lowered rates 1%, but the bond yields on the US bonds have gone up 1%, which is the opposite to what you would think logically would happen. So what that's sending the message is the bond market thinks that these policies are going to be inflationary. And so the bond market is a bit more negative on what's going on. Now, if all these things do get carried through and we do end up with more tariffs and so forth, then I think the really obvious thing is the US dollar is going to rally and the Aussie dollar, amongst other currencies, is going to weaken. And that's already starting to happen. That's not new. That's already happening. I think the safe haven and I don't want to, and I've got to be careful because I don't want to sound like I'm giving advice, but if you look what's happening in the gold price, gold is rocketing up to all-time highs, and I think that's also sending a message as well, because gold, I think, ultimately is a hedge against geopolitical instability, and I think that's what the gold price is telling us. Things are uncertain, plus there's a huge amount of just general central bank demand because America's enemies, if you like, the BRICS, Russia, India, etc., all of those are trying to diversify away from the US dollar. So gold might be a stronger one, although bear in mind it was up 30% last year, 40% in Aussie dollars. So one would expect that that's going to have a bit of a breather as well.
Well, you might like some insights from our special guest, Alex Cook. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. Let's take a call. Richard is in Alstonville in New South Wales. Hey, Richard, welcome back.
G'day, guys. Just had a couple of questions for you. The first one being, I was listening to the news or watching the news the other day, and they were talking about the rate cut coming up. And one person they interviewed mentioned something about the Reserve Bank coming closer in line with the policy of government. And my question is, if the Reserve Bank started tailing more the way they did stuff to government policy, would that be bad for us?
Okay. Richard, good question. Alex?
Can you elaborate a bit more on what they say by aligning it more with government policy? I mean, governments generally like rates coming down, right? Because governments don't like the negative sentiment of, households under pressure and all that kind of thing. So I think they would love to see a rate cut, particularly obviously coming into an election year. I think Albo would love to see rate cuts to support those that are struggling, because Australia's had a big setback in terms of its standard of living over the past couple of years. So
I'm approaching it from the factor of this person said, the Reserve Bank never passes policy to support the government, right? And I'm coming at it from the point of, I believe that Reserve Bank should never do the agenda of the government. It's up to the government to put good stable policy in place so the Reserve Bank can cut rates in time. Because if the Reserve Bank bows to the government, then our economy would crash all the time, because the job of the Reserve Bank is to keep the dollar stable, keep the market.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of thinking, I guess the question I'm asking is, if the Reserve Bank started bowing to policy rather than doing what they do best, would that affect our economy, do you think?
Oh, I think so. I mean, you made a very good point, and that is that the central bank, even though it's technically a government institution, is meant to be independent, right? So it's not meant to be impacted by the whim of politicians telling them what to do. And the US has the same problem, because Donald Trump's trying to pressure the Federal Reserve to lower rates there, right? So, but to me, they need to stand true and be independent. And once again, you made a very good point. What is the role of the RBA? The role of the RBA is economic stability and full employment. That's their mandate. And so to do that, they need to remain independent. Now, the problem that they have is they only control monetary policy, they only control interest rates, and they have only very limited levers, whereas the government has the fiscal policy, or so all the spending. So there is a real problem when they don't necessarily agree, and what Albo's been doing has been spending, which is inflationary, and that's why inflation in Australia hasn't come down, although it wasn't as bad as some of the others, but hasn't come down as much, and as a result, the central bank in Australia hasn't lowered rates yet, which it has in Canada, has in America, has in New Zealand. And so it's a very fine line they have to walk, because they are still a political animal. It's a government entity. And of course, the government hires and fires the Reserve Bank governor. So even though they're meant to be independent, there's still obviously political issues that they have to contend with.
And someone's job is on the line, and there's pressure there to conform. That's, I think, where you were talking there, Richard. Anything further to add, Richard?
Yeah, I did have another question. I'm hearing this thing about like inflationary the other day, and I was listening to Sky News, and they don't normally do that, but they blamed it on the Morrison government for the reason we have high inflation, because when they left office, it was starting to come down. But they were saying, I've heard some people argue that they spent $1 trillion when they were in government last time, but what about the question of there was $270 billion put aside for future defence spending, and that was part of the $1 billion spending. So my question is, does Morrison and Frydenberg cop a lot of flack for inflation when actually they saved a lot of money that this government has actually had to spend? Do you think?
It's a great question. I personally think Morrison and Frydenberg have a lot to answer for, because the amount of money they pumped into the system was mind-boggling. It was about, I think, $300 billion in excess spending. Like, the deficit was mind-boggling. It was when we had the global financial crisis in 2008, response was 4 times as big. So absolutely massive response, and other countries did it too, by the way. So Australia's not alone in this, but that started the inflation, no question. But where I think Albo is guilty, and their government, is they've A, kept the spending high, and B, they've ramped up immigration. So immigration prior to the year 2000 was about 80, 90,000 a year. Under Howard Costello, it jumped up to about 150, 200, around that level. And then under Albo, it's close to 500,000 per annum. So that when you're bringing that many people into the economy that are going to spend, you're talking about an inflationary impact. It's inevitable.
You know, Alex, we could talk about clever investing when it comes to all of the different changes that are going on in an unsettled world. Some people get rich in these sorts of times. The other thing is, of course, how do you protect your finances in times like this? Let's talk biblical wisdom for a few moments, because this is an area of your real expertise. If we're talking about where we ought to be thinking, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, you know, we're talking about the uncertainty. We talked about the investments. The Bible gives fantastic wisdom on this, particularly in this sort of uncertain period. So Ecclesiastes 11:2, and you might have heard me quote it before, is that it says, invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8, because you do not know what disaster may come upon the land. And of course, we've experienced a lot of that over the last, 4 or 5 years with COVID, etc. And now, of course, you've had the wars, and there's just, I think many people are almost worn out by just the daily bombardment of news and things going on around the world. But the good news is the Bible, obviously we know how the whole story ends, but the good news is Bible gives us great wisdom along the way on how to think and how to steward our resources well. So as I say, from an investment perspective, the number one thing, I think, we talked before about the share market, bonds and gold. To me, someone like me can come on and, pontificate about these things, but at the end of the day, no one knows the future, and therefore the Bible's wisdom of diversification and not putting all your eggs in one basket is extremely important. Because the funny thing I see when people come and see me often for the first time, one of the common mistakes I see people make is being very heavily weighted towards one investment. They've got too much in the wrong things. And that's why I say the Bible gives us great wisdom, and it basically gives us a humble view that we don't know the future, and therefore we should diversify. So that's the first thing I think listeners can do to protect their finances in a climate like this.
Our talkback line open 1800 316 316. You might have something that brings us into a practical scenario, one that you might be interested in. Let me ask you about the possibility of our interest rates being cut here in Australia, and whether that might actually be the trigger of another housing boom. People might be out there deciding to borrow lots of money because there might be a 0.25% drop in our interest rates. What about the prospects for borrowing? You might be thinking about buying a first home, or you might be thinking about an investment property. What sort of prospects are there when interest rates are expected to be cut?
Yeah, it's a great question. So look, the current speculation is that we'll probably see up to 3 rate cuts this year. Of course, at the end of the day, no one actually knows. In fact, when I was a mortgage broker, people would often say to me, Alex, should I fix my loan or should I have a variable loan? And I always said, look, at the end of the day, no one has a clue where ultimate direction of interest rates is. Now, because the economy is getting weaker, and GDP is, and Australia's been in a GDP per capita recession now for 2 years. So even though GDP is technically positive, on a per capita basis, it's been negative now for 8 quarters. So Australia is a weak economy. So to me, if we get interest rate cuts, that will obviously support the economy. But I think it's a great opportunity for everyone, but for Christians especially, to use as a chance not to borrow more, but to actually pay down your debt. Because a lot of people, particularly during COVID, when rates dropped down to 2%, borrowed huge amounts of money, which of course is what's driven housing up. And now they're struggling. They're in a lot of pain. They've got very little cash flow left. So to me, lower rates is an opportunity not to borrow more and go spending, but rather to pay down your debt as much as you possibly can. Especially if you go back to the 70s, inflation spiked, then they got it under control, then it spiked again. And so if we have a situation, and I think this is a real risk, that inflation, yes, it's come down over the last 12 months across most of the West, but if it picks up again, then obviously the Reserve Bank will have little choice but to keep rates high and maybe even put them higher. And that's not what's being talked about. So I would encourage people not to go rushing out to buy houses, because housing on any measure you look at Australia has one of the most overpriced housing markets on planet Earth. It's more than double its long-term averages. Depending on where you look, it's sort of between 10 and 14 times people's incomes, where the long-term average is more like 4 or 5 times income. So to me, this is a time to align your finances with God's word. And God's word is very clear, not that debt is bad or sinful, but that debt can lead to slavery. So if we do get rate cuts, this is your chance to get out of slavery, pay down your debt. And if house prices, yes, they may rise a little bit because of it, but I think housing is so unaffordable that the upside is pretty limited, in my view.
Just to take us off on perhaps a little bit of a tangent here, when it comes to house prices and expectations that some have that those house prices just will continue to rise. A lot of people have been waiting for a fall. That hasn't happened. And for a decade or more, house prices have just been continuing to rise. Harder and harder for that young family to get a hold and into the housing market, looking for that first home, and everything they're looking at buying is getting smaller. There's challenging times here. So you might already have a debt, and your advice is here, or your insight, to pay that debt down, take the opportunity. It's more of a biblical focus. What about those who are not in debt, looking to get into a housing market, knowing that prices may well continue to rise, and this sort of fear of missing out type of thing, that you just going to take the plunge and go into a big debt? What are your thoughts here, Alex?
Look, it's a tough question, because, as I mentioned earlier, prices are so extreme. The other point to say is everyone's circumstances are different. If my sort of position on this is always been that your mortgage repayments shouldn't exceed 30% of your disposable income. That's been my sort of position for a long time. However, at the moment, if you look at some of the stats, it takes a lot more than 10 years just to save for a deposit. But if you were to buy a house, say in Sydney, the stats show that you'd be spending 50% of your income in mortgage repayments. So when you add that in, plus taxes, you're basically giving 80% of your money away between banks and the ATO, which to me is madness, because I think as Christians, there are so many other things that we need to sow into. Now, yes, renting has gone up dramatically in Australia in the past few years, but I think that's probably topped out because I don't think it's any more affordable. But to me, as a believer, I've got to say to myself, okay, I still need to sow into kingdom things, and is owning a house the be all and end all? Have I met my responsibilities to God to sow into things that have eternal value as opposed to just owning a piece of real estate? And I think one of the big problems in the church in the West and in Australia especially is we're much more obsessed with home ownership than we are with God's kingdom. And I think that is idolatry, and I think it's a big problem. Now, I think I've gone off on a slight tangent here because we're talking about first home buyers, but my view is first home buyers have a very, very tough road if they buy in, because they're buying at, as I say, the most extreme valuations ever in the nation's history, with household debt at the most extreme level of it's ever been. And so my message to young people is get as big a deposit as you can, start small so that your risk level is low. The other thing is you have to ask yourself, if you're married, say you're a young couple, you're 25 years of age, can you pay the mortgage on just one income? Because more than likely you'll end up in a situation where you got the first child come along and then the second and third. Do you really want to be forced to go back to work 3 months after the baby's born, all just to keep a mortgage and roof over your head? I just think, and this is why I think what's going on in Australia, if I was to put a blunt thing on it, I'd call it evil. I think what we're doing with home ownership is destroying the social fabric of our society. Because, what I see when I talk to friends who, say, live in nice big houses in Sydney, they all say the same thing to me. Our kids will never live anywhere near us. And what a sad thing as a parent to say, knowing full well that your kids they're all going to move to other states or rural areas or anywhere where they can afford a house. And that, to me, is evil. And that's what our society has done. And so as Christians, I think we need to step back, get real about what's really important, have low debt, focus on giving and being generous and building God's kingdom, and just be sensible stewards so that when the inevitable happens, and that is, I have a saying, what can't go on forever won't go on forever. And so inevitably the housing bubble will pop. Now, is it in a year? Is it in 6 years? I couldn't tell you. But beware, because now is not the time to follow the world's ways and leverage yourself to the hilt and become a slave for the next 20, 30 years. That's not what God wants. And I think it's very unwise.
Alex, let's stay with this for a few moments, because undoubtedly there are those who are going to have an issue with contentment. This fear of missing out, the thought that, I've got to get in there and I've got to do that. I might as well take the plunge. Now's going to be as good a time as any, some might be thinking. But when you're talking about seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, above all of these other materialistic expressions, even the buying of a house, there's a contentment issue there. Is that something you've got to sort of grapple with around money, your own contentment?
No, absolutely. And look, I think there's social pressure and social norms. Most Christian parents will say to their kids, the first thing you do is you go and buy your own home. And historically, I would have said that's very good advice. I think by the time you get to retirement, you do want to have your own roof over your head that's fully paid off. I think that's sensible. But when things get this out of control, and you now have all these other competing priorities, particularly as a believer, I think we need to bring it back to what's important and trust God for our provision. Trust God that he'll provide for a roof over our head, rather than buying into this lie that I have to own a home. As I say, it's a good thing in the long run, but it's not a good thing if you're enslaved and you can't live a fruitful life. Because one of the things debt does is it may limit you and prevent you from fulfilling your calling. What if God is calling you to go to do something else, or he's calling you out of corporate world into voluntary work or into ministry or anything like that? Are you by taking on too much debt, are you putting yourself into a position where you're not allowing God to provide for you and to give you opportunities to fulfill your calling? And that's, to me, the danger of debt. The devil wants us enslaved, and that's not what God's agenda is. So I think we need to think very carefully and wisely and not get discontent so easily.
Taking calls on 1800 316 316. Let's hear from Adam in Wauchope in New South Wales. Hey, Adam, welcome.
Oh, good morning and good afternoon, depending where you're sitting.
Yes.
But just very quickly, I know we're at the end of the show, but we've really got to change our minds on how we start off and getting into real estate. The world has gone so far from where all our forefathers and where even I started off when I was 21 back in the 90s after a terrible recession. It takes great sacrifice to get into property. You don't go in at level 10, you go in at level 1, okay? You've got to put everything else aside, big cars, holidays overseas and everything else if you want to get into the market. The property I bought in 1997, I don't own it anymore, but I was 21. I was on $172 a week in real estate starting off as an 18-year-old, $172 a week. I had to have 2 other jobs. It was a $180,000 apartment. I had to stick a tenant in it. I was still living at home as a 21-year-old. That's the only way I could get into the market. And I had another godfather help me off with a bit of a gap, which my deposit wasn't big enough.
Adam, sometimes it takes that joint effort, and some might be thinking, I'm hearing Adam's story here, a joint effort required, looking out for others to help you get started. I think, Adam, did you have something specific, or that's the sort of thing that you're talking about?
It is what I'm talking about, but it's sacrifice. You can't just have everything else and then get into the property market. You've got to try and think of a different way to get into the ground floor. That was in Bellevue Hill in Sydney where I started, by the way. You don't have to start off in a suburb out in you just got to search out the bargains. You've got to search out what you can afford, and you've got to search out what you don't need in your life to actually get started. Like my grandparents, they come back from World War II. Lived in a tin shed for the first 3 years from 1945 to 1948, just so they could afford their big home that they had until they died.
Adam, let's get a thought or two from Alex. Alex, what are you thinking around Adam's comments?
A couple of things. Firstly, I agree with his sentiment and his practicality to it. So I think he's right. When you're young, you need to make sacrifices in order to get in, and so forth. That's I think really important, and also the idea of starting small and working your way up. Because I think a lot of people, they grow up, they've seen their parents' house and they think that's what their parents had from day one, when in fact the parents lived in a small 2-bedroom unit and had second-hand furniture, and so they want what their parents had from day one. So where I agree with him is with both the sentiment and that sort of practical, start small, work your way up, sacrifice. I think that is very sensible and thrifty. I think that's a good thing. Where I think the problem is, though, is the values are so extreme that is not even possible. So to give you an idea, the Sydney Morning Herald put out an article before Christmas saying to buy the median house in Sydney, you need an income of $290,000. So how many households in Australia, it's less than 10% of houses have $290,000 in income. So buying a house in Sydney now is impossible for 90% of the people. That's how crazy it is. And that's true across other cities, just different degrees. Sydney's by far the worst. Melbourne and others aren't as bad. But the other issue, I think, from a family structure point of view, is do we want a situation where both husband and wife are burning themselves out just to have a house? And so, in other words, there's sacrifice, right, which is sensible, but then there's crazy sacrifice whereby both partners are burning themselves out in the workforce and the kids are neglected, or kids don't get things they need, and all these other things, as well as the kingdom being funded because we're so indebted. And that's where I think you've got to be really careful, because his principles that Adam mentioned I think are great, but the prices now are so extreme that I think it's beyond that for most people and the average Aussie, and that's what the numbers are showing us now. I mean, it's crazy.
Adam, I want to thank you so much for your contribution. We are almost out of time, but having said what has been delivered here. Some might be disheartened hearing these sorts of things around, maybe it's not the time to borrow. You don't get in, and the dream might not be there as easily accessible as it might have been in some previous generations. There might be others thinking, well, if I'm not going to be investing in real estate because of the challenges that are going on right now, Alex, is there a way that you ought to be looking to build some wealth? And perhaps we're not talking get rich quick, but certainly we don't want to go backwards. Any thoughts here in these last few minutes?
100%. Look, to me, you got to keep your money simple. In fact, the Bible says to gain wealth little by little. But the simple thing here is you do your household budget, and the critical thing for everyone listening is that you have a surplus. In other words, you live beneath your means. So and this is really, I think, comes back to what Adam was saying before, right? You've got to sacrifice. So you've got to live beneath your means, spend less than what you earn, try and save a minimum of 10%, ideally even more if you can, especially if you live at home with your parents, and set that money aside for the future and invest it. And build it over time so that you're still building wealth, irrespective, obviously, of what's going on in the housing market. And there's lots of other things you can invest in. And once again, coming back to that biblical principle of diversifying. But the thing is, do it little by little, be intentional by using your surplus income and building a surplus if you don't have one, so that you can build wealth and get ahead, irrespective of the housing market.
Well, outstanding insights as always, Alex Cook. And for listeners to connect with Alex, you can find Alex at his Wealth with Purpose website, wealthwithpurpose.com. And there's lots of great free resources available through the Wealth with Purpose website, free ebooks, the My Toolkit. There are videos, there's podcast content there for wisdom. And I guess, it's not that easy to find sound biblical wisdom on finances. And you've got that with Alex Cook, who's the founder of Wealth with Purpose. You can follow Alex too on Facebook and on Twitter. There's even an askalex@wealthwithpurpose.com email address as well. So, Alex, always great getting your insights. I look forward to lots of great conversations with you coming through the year. But thanks so much for those great insights today on 2020.
My pleasure. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.